Great. Thank you so much, Donna. So I know we have a lot of folks registered for the webinar, so folks will be rotating on fairly soon. And this is actually the second webinar I did today. We had one webinar with Building Healthy Places Network, and I want to just put a shout out to them for kicking off a wonderful webinar this morning that was specifically around health data at the neighborhood level, which is fantastic, with a group of panelists, which is great. So this is the second part of the sort of my conversation today about Opportunity 360, and I'm so glad to have folks who are also rotating onto this webinar to continue that conversation about data and how it can help us make the case for what we're trying to do. In this case, we're going to talk a lot about the affordable housing space and what is the kind of data that helps us to make the case for that. And actually, I'm going to do a lot. I'm going to really be talking a little bit about the data, but also how that aligns with the kind of narrative development that we know works well to make this effectively the case that we're trying to make for housing. So I'm going to go ahead and start. I'm going to say, first of all, just as Donna just kind of introduced us just a second ago, there are two of us on the panel today. Donna does all of our kind of webinars internal to enterprise, so she'll be on the chat line along with another of my colleagues, Tina Horn, also to begin answering some of the questions. So if you have questions along the way, feel free to chat away, and they'll be answering some of those questions as we go through, particularly the ones that are easier to kind of get through. So I'm Tiffany Manuel. I'm our Vice President for Knowledge, Impact, and Strategy here at Enterprise Community Partners. I lead a team, a dedicated, really smart, thoughtful team of folks who think about data and analytics and evidence and research all the time, and not just kind of in a vacuum in a very academic sense, but they think about it in terms of how we can actually use that data to do some great positive aspects of things out in the world. So that's what we do at Enterprise. What I want to say just, I hope that, most of you got the invitation through Enterprise, so most of the folks on the call should know Enterprise, but I'll just say that our mission has always been at Enterprise to create opportunity to low and moderate income people through affordable housing in diverse and thriving communities. So we think about housing first, but also all of the other connections that are important for making sure that people have a thriving place to live. And we do that through providing capital, about $7 billion of capital a year in communities all across the country. We manage about $24.5 billion in assets, but also we do a lot in terms of providing solutions, programmatic solutions, and a lot in the policy space, not only at the federal level, but also increasingly at the state and local levels. But what I wanted to emphasize here is just our mission has always been around this issue of opportunity, and that is the thing that has really gotten us to sort of push us in the direction of measurement even more fully than we might have been before. This Opportunity 360 conversation really came out of our strategic plan quite a while ago when we were trying to figure out how do we understand, we know how many units of housing we're doing, we know how many federally qualified health centers we are funding, we know how many charter school seats, we know how many earned income tax credit programs we are seeding across, in various places. We know how many of those kinds of things, but what we don't know is how the neighborhoods and communities that we're working in, investing large amounts of money in, our time, our talent, our resources, everything that we have to bring to help low and moderate income families in places across the country, we don't know how the communities are changing in response to those kinds of investments. And so Opportunity 360 really emerged as a way of us asking the question, when I look at the spirit of what you see on the screen of these kids, like how do we begin to measure that, the sort of vibrancy of places? How do we begin to understand both the strengths of neighborhoods and places and the people in those places, but also the challenges that folks are facing, and how do we weave that together in both a view of the data but also a narrative that helps us to advance more of that work in the places where we're working. And so it really emerged as a for Enterprise, and as we began to talk to a lot of our partners all across the country, we're a national organization with many local offices across the country, we heard from folks that this kind of resource could certainly be useful for Enterprise, but that there was a need for that for a wide range of organizations that we work with across the country. And so a lot of what we have as a data resources are now being shared more publicly with anybody who wants them. So all of these resources that I'm going to talk about are on our website. So what's the vision of kind of what we're trying to do? I think from our vantage point, it's that to recognize that every community is really a community of opportunity. I I can't stand it. I really, you know, I hate it when people say there's a community of opportunity, and when they say that, they only mean the neighborhoods where, you know, you've got these great schools, you got all this great stuff, and and they don't talk about the kind of assets that are in all communities. So I think a part of, from my vantage point, the sort of takeover effect is, or if there's any agenda underneath this platform, it's really helping us to recognize that every community is a community of opportunity. What we need to do, however, is to understand what are the things that are working well in those places, whether or not you're a high-income community that could be more hospitable, let's just say that, for folks who are lower income or moderate income, or whether you are a low-income community where folks are struggling potentially in those places, but you've got great access to transit and you've got people who are vibrant. How do we both recognize both those strengths and also the challenges? And so our vision is that every community would be recognized as a community of opportunity, and that we would be strengthening, when I say we, I'm talking about the community development sector, that we would be working always to strengthen the pathways that ensure that people have access to a better life. That's the vision of what we're trying to do. And so I'll talk a little bit about kind of where we are with that. So I have a really, I have to say that I have a really ambitious schedule plan for this webinar. In fact, we might not get through everything. Certainly folks who I work with will tell you that I am always overly ambitious in terms of what I think I can do in some of these webinars and some of that conversations. But it's just because I'm so excited about the potential, about what we know from an evidence-based perspective about what data makes a difference, what messaging actually makes a difference, and how we blend the two. So from my vantage point, there are a couple things. First, starting with what is the data that actually exists in Opportunity 360, and I'm going to do kind of a summary of that. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about why our use of the data often backfires on us. So even when we have great data, if we're not being thoughtful about the kind of messaging we're embedding, we're embedding that data in, then it can still backfire, and we need to be very thoughtful about that. I'm going to talk about 2 techniques from the data front, or maybe more than that, a couple techniques to help us to avoid some of that backfire, and then I'm going to open it up to Q&A. So for those of you who, hopefully those of you who have come to stick around and to get some really good, both high-level recommendations, but also some practical applications. All right. So let's just start with what we already know about opportunity. When we first started this process, there were lots of things we knew about opportunity, right, as an idea that was guiding our work. First of all, we knew that housing insecurity, just how much people are actually paying for housing, and especially renters, which is what a lot of what Enterprise has focused on in the past. We knew that the numbers of folks who were paying too much for housing was rising, whether you looked at that from the vantage point of people who were moderately rent burdened, paying 30% or more for their housing, or for those who were severely housing cost burden, paying 50% or more. And I always like to show this graph, mostly because what I always want to say about this is not a recent problem. This is not something that happened last week, last year, 2 years ago. We have been seeing the rise of this issue of housing affordability over a number of decades, right? And so now we have reached a point where it is at a crescendo where we have to begin to address some of these issues, and I think what I'm hoping is some of the data and our sort of understanding of messaging helps us to begin to do that. In addition to that, we also know that it's not just about what's happening for renters. The renters are those sort of 10 million who are severely cost burdened. We know there are about 10 million folks across the country who are severely cost burdened in terms of housing, meaning they're paying 50% or more for their housing. But we also know there's about approximately 600,000 folks who are homeless on any given night in the United States, about 9 million homeowners who are paying 50% or more of their income for their mortgages. And then even once we move the housing aside, even if folks are in, especially low-income families, if they're in a position where they are not paying the exorbitant amounts for housing, what we know is that they are likely living in places where they don't have access to the other things they need, access to transit to get to a job or to get to places in the region, access to good schools or access to jobs. And so either way, whether you think about it from the housing perspective or the neighborhoods around where people live, this is becoming a huge issue for the nation, and we have to begin to address it. The final slide I'll just say at a really high level on this sort of what we know about this is it's not just the housing, it's not just the kind of access and proximity, but it's also the combination of those things. The concentration of poverty in places is becoming more severe across sort of racial designations. So whether you're white or black or Latino, across these spectrums, we're seeing an increasing number of Americans living in high poverty neighborhoods. And I thought I would show just the Lee Street corridor in Atlanta. Enterprise has been working, has been one of the organizations leading the Spark Initiative, the Strong, Prosperous, and Resilient Communities Challenge, that's working heavily in a part of Atlanta called the Lee Street corridor, which combines a couple of various census tracts in the region. So when you look at this graph here, what this shows in 1970, the pink outline there is the Lee Street corridor in Atlanta. The red, or I would say the darker pink areas are places where poverty is, where you have extreme poverty, where there are 40% or more of the people in those neighborhoods who are living under the federal poverty line. And the federal poverty line is for the most part, federal poverty line is under about $20,000 for a family of four, a little higher than that. So 40% or more of the people in those neighborhoods are living for a family of four, which is, I could go off and just say that's outrageous, but for a family of four, right, about $20,000 a year. And even the yellow aspects of that, around that, are families that are communities where 20 to 40% of the high poverty areas, not extreme, but high poverty areas, where 20 to 40% of the population is in high poverty. Same thing, living in places where a good number of folks are living on the federal poverty line. And the gray are areas where poverty is more consistent with where it is across the country. This is what happened. This was in 1970. But if I advance in a little bit of a time advance, what you see is by 1980, look at how both the yellow areas across the region have spread, and as well as the dark pink. And if you look at the specific area, that Lee Street corridor, which is the outline in pink, you can see more of that area beginning to represent both extreme and high income poverty. And when I advance it even more to the year 2000, you can see that almost the entire Lee Street corridor represents areas that are either in high or extreme poverty. But look at the entire region, right? You're looking at the city of Atlanta, where you've got extreme poverty almost taking over kind of the area. And if I were to advance it to 2015, the latest year for which data is available at this level, you can see across the region just the level of poverty, the sheer level of poverty spreading consistently across the region. So what I want to say about that is a couple things. Number one, we know that these issues, not just the poverty, but a whole range of issues around inequality overall, are getting worse in our nation and have to be addressed. What I would say is one of the challenges that we're facing is that the data that we need to understand the strategies that we might bring to various parts of the country, to these neighborhoods, is different. And we haven't had the kind of data that would allow us to both drill down into these neighborhoods to understand what are the relative strengths and challenges in these places, but also to understand how those neighborhoods, if we were to stand out, compared to other neighborhoods both across the region. So you could look at a map like this across an entire region, but also even compare those to things that are outside of the region. So part of Opportunity 360 is what's the kind of data that allows me to certainly say, to talk about what's happening in terms of poverty, but to bring a more nuanced understanding of these neighborhoods and of these places and what's happening to people in these places to the table. So Opportunity 360 has a couple things. There's two major things I would say that we're really interested in thinking about. One is thinking about opportunity outcomes, which are outcomes for people. So what's happening to people? Are people more stably housed in terms of housing? Do they have access to decent quality education? What's the health and well-being of the people who live there? Do people have access to jobs, or what's the poverty rate? Some of the data I just shared with you. And then this issue of mobility. Can folks get around? Are they within a decent commute time to a job? Those are outcomes for people. The more challenging thing has been in our field to measure the pathways to how you get there, right? So the pathways are not just sort of for you as an individual, are you under the federal poverty line, or do you have a job, or do you have a decent level of education, but in your community, right? Do you have access to a transit system that can get you to a decent job? Do you have access to a decent school system that can educate your children effectively so they can get jobs? Are you living in a home that is green, like that has some ability to promote your health? And so when we think about the pathways, from our vantage point, it's not only important that we understand those outcomes, but it's also important to understand the pathways for how you get there. And from our vantage point, people matter, right? The level of, when we think about opportunity, people matter, right? The level of grit, right? The level of work ethic you bring to it matters, right? We know that. We hear a lot about that. The bootstraps that you got, right? Okay, right? We got that. Bootstraps matter. But also the homes that we're in, they matter. Is this a place that promotes your health or not? The buildings that you're in, right, matters. We also know that neighborhoods matter. What's around you? Do you have access to a decent grocery store? Do you have access to a dry cleaner? If you right, do you have access to the things that you need at parks and other kinds of things that actually help you to advance your own life? And the same thing about networks. Networks matter. Are you invested in it and engaged with the networks in that community, but also other kinds of networks? And finally, policies and systems matter. So from our vantage point, what we were trying to do and have been engaged in as part of Opportunity 360 is really thinking constructively about how do we bring a different level of data to the work that we do in community development. Can we have data that is strategic for decision making, that is granular enough that I can drill all the way down to a particular neighborhood, but also data that has the breadth where I can span out and see an entire region and how a particular place might be different, that two places, two census tracts right next door to each other may have different strengths and challenges and also weaknesses that must be addressed. And so what you find in Opportunity 360 is, I would say, four real kind of, opportunities for us to get at this issue of opportunity. One is a measure tool, and actually there's several there's tools in that sort of measure toolkit. The one that I think probably excites people the most is the ability to go into measure. You can go to enterprisecommunity.org/opportunity360, and if you go into the measure tool, you can click on measure. You can put a street address. It has to be a street address. Can't be just kind of a, right, city or state, right? You have to have a street address. But if you give it a street address in that system, it will provide for you a 30-page report that goes over, that gives you an overview of opportunity in that neighborhood, but also at the top of it, give you a way to contextualize some of that information. That neighborhood compared to every other neighborhood in the nation and on the index, but also that neighborhood compared to every other neighborhood in the state and every other neighborhood in the region. So you get both the granularity of what's happening across these different sectors, housing, workforce development, education, et cetera, but you also get the breadth that comes from being able to compare that to other places. There are listen tools. From our vantage point, it's important not just that you measure, but also that you are listening to what residents are saying about what is working in their neighborhoods and what is not. And so you'll see a variety of tools in the platform to help you understand how to be more thoughtful about listening to residents as part of that platform. And then also a whole series of tools around partnering, about how you partner. How do you find relevant, if you're in housing space, how do you find relevant partners in the health space or the food space or job training space who are providing low or no cost services that can be very useful for, especially for low and moderate income families. And so there's a partner tool there that allows you to do that. And then finally, an evaluate tool, which is not a tool per se, but what we have provided there are resources for how enterprise does kind of impact assessment and evaluation, but also some reports that show you how we do how we derive some of the social returns on the investment. So how do we understand, if we look at health outcomes of some of the investments that we've made in the health space, what can we say about the value of those health outcomes back to folks who want to invest in those kinds of programs and things across the country? So as I said before, one of the things that gets folks excited is the ability to download, right, to put any neighborhood in the country and within 7 seconds get a comprehensive report back. And this is an example, just a couple of the screenshots of a report. You can download that report, take it anywhere you want to, and we'll be updating this data quarterly to the extent that there are updates to any piece of information in there. And so from our vantage point, providing that kind of data and information for anybody who wants it at the community level is a huge kind of capacity building opportunity for our sector to have the kind of data that right now we struggle to get access to. And I'll say, you know, from our vantage point, what's been really difficult and what people have been so far really excited about is that just in terms of the time savings that this creates for lots of folks. You all know when you try to make the case for your work, a lot of times what happens is that you are trying hard to find data from all these sources, and you get the health data at the county level, and then this other data about transit is at the zip code level, and this other data, and the human services space is at the continuum of care level, and then you get this other data over here that the housing data is at the, you know, metropolitan area, and then some of the data is 2015, and some of the data is 2012, and some of the data is 2001, and you're trying to pull all that together in a way and to make sense of that, to communicate about what's happening in places, and it has been incredibly difficult for our partners to do that. And so from our vantage point, this is a resource that takes at least some of the pain out of that process. So what I want to say about that is there's a lot kind of embedded in the framework of what we're doing in addition to the data, and a lot of things that from our vantage point really represent our approach. I won't go through this except to say that just understand from our vantage point, we're looking at how the pathways differ from those outcomes and being very thoughtful about how they're related, but also how they can be differentiated. We care about multiple levels of opportunity. People, places, and systems matter, and we're measuring at those levels, right, as part of our understanding of opportunity. We believe that community residents and stakeholders should be involved in the redevelopment or the development of their neighborhoods, right, as equal partners in that process, which is why you see those listen tools. We certainly believe that equity should be an explicit lens that we bring to it, and so you'll see us really leaning into some of those data platforms, really dividing up, cutting some of that data across, for example, racial equity lines or some of those kinds of issues. You see that in the platform. We also understand that in order to build public support for the work that we do, we have to be thoughtful about the narratives that we're creating using this data so that we increase, I should say, public support for what we do and depress those things that are not leaning forward in terms of our systems change efforts. And then we understand that just data and technology has to advance more inclusive development for our communities. And so you'll see all of that sort of reflected in the range of things in Opportunity 360. So let me just also say, because one of the things that I'm also fired up about is not just the provision of this data. So what I want you to do is certainly go on the website and to get access to all this data. But what I don't want you to do is take all that data and put it back into the traditional kind of messages that we've done in the past, mostly because for a variety of reasons we know that a lot of those messages have been backfiring in ways that are not terribly helpful for us. So when I think about the backfire effect, the backfire effect often happens when you have on the left side, for example, you know, folks in our sector, housing and community development experts, we're trying to be thoughtful about the messages that we're crafting. And on the other side, you have the public and policymakers, and we're trying to advance a conversation that is progressive about what we can do to change systems that better meets the needs of low and moderate income families. And what comes back at us is a backfire, that we say we need to help folks, and people say to us back, well, I don't see why those folks aren't helping themselves. And those folks are not, you know, poor people are poor because they make poor decisions or poor choices. And so that's not exactly, right, the kind of conversation we're trying to engender. But if we're not changing the narrative about what's happening in places, that's exactly what happens in terms of our work. And I wanted to be thoughtful specifically about data and how that comes back at us. So I want to give some examples. On the left side is an article that appeared in an LA newspaper, and it was a relatively benign newspaper article, which is saying that LA residents, for the most part, you need to make about $33 an hour to afford a decent apartment in LA, and that is really significant. So first of all, that's significantly over and above what any low and moderate income families tend to make in the region. And so what happened, and the pushback, there's a lot of pushback around, you know, poor people make poor choices, these people, right, a whole range of things that you would not expect from a relatively benign article. But many of the comments that came back were not just challenging the idea that we should be investing in affordable housing, but they were challenging the data itself. So the data became the flashpoint for example, in the conversation, this particular person's comments, they said, listen, this is a falsehood. If you make, the average rent that I can see is about $1,600 a month. Me and my wife, we don't make that combined, and we're able essentially to do that. So they're talking, so now they're getting into the sort of semantics about what you can afford at various levels. But at the very bottom, this person says, then I realized that some academic organization at USC was nice enough to bestow a new, albeit arbitrary, meaning for affordable. That is to say, 30% of one's paycheck on rent is considered quote-unquote affordable. Anything beyond it is not. Leave it to colleges to redefine words for political purposes. And so now a conversation that was really just about some basic data about how much it costs to live in a particular place has become the flashpoint of the backfire for this particular conversation. Another article came, I think a year or two ago, just around 1 in 5 Americans have sacrificed in order to afford rent, and you see the kind of comments that it engendered. It was all about data. It was like, listen, we did this survey. This is the number of folks who said that they are now making trade-offs between things like groceries that they need to feed their children and the ability to pay the rent. And you see the kind of comments that came back with American obesity at an all-time high. Cutting the grocery bill is actually a good thing. Or folks who said, oh yeah, so people are sacrificing, great, we all have to sacrifice. And the bottom one that says, doesn't everybody except the very rich have to give up something, right, in order to be able to afford top priorities like housing? I would like to spend more on other things, but essentially I can't. And so the data, which is meant to suggest, right, to help people really understand the depths of the fact that people are making pretty dangerous trade-offs, right, between medicines that they need or food for their families, and that they're not able to do that. And what's happened is the data itself has become a flashpoint. Same thing with another article that was about a retirement, a guy who was in retirement who had faced a lot of medical problems. This is on NPR, which is a fairly progressive, I would say, kind of media outlet. And the response of that, the kind of comments that came back, were all about this particular person and why didn't he save for retirement, and more importantly, the sort of going back and forth around the data. How much does it actually cost? Well, it can't cost that much, and you should look harder, and if you can't afford to live in that community, you should live in another community. And so all that to say, I can certainly belabor the point, but the point that I'm trying to make here is that data in and of itself won't get you out of this challenge. And in fact, even especially when we are trying to increasingly, we're being asked to and are trying to invest our resources in neighborhoods where there is opportunity, there's quote-unquote opportunity, where the schools are decent and it's got decent access to transit, we get a lot of community opposition. And so a colleague and I have written quite a bit about this sort of community opposition and how folks can begin to get over some of that. But all of that, right, can sometimes make us feel as though facts don't matter. So you get all this data and you provide it, you have media outlets do stories around it, and you provide it because you think it can change the nature of the conversation, and then you get back certainly some comments that are thoughtful for people who want to support affordable housing, but you often get a lot of that pushback. People say, that they don't support it. If they do support it, they'll say, I think we should have affordable housing, just not in my neighborhood, right? And so, our ability to use data and facts becomes challenging when we see that getting that kind of backfire when we try to use it. So I say, for one thing, when we think about, I want to say there's a lot that's challenging about the way that we think about data and how we use it as part of a way to build support for what we do. One part of it is that we've got data, but so does everybody else. And so I just pulled this up. On the left side is something that came from the census around just the fact that the poverty rate has reached a near record high, right? It's talking about historically where that has been, and that there are just record numbers of folks who are living in conditions of high poverty. And on the right side, an article that many years ago from J.Q. Wilson talking about, basically saying, people aren't really poor in this country. If you look at the average poor family, they have a TV, 2-color TVs, they have cable, they have a DVD, they have a VCR, if they have children, or especially boys, they have an Xbox or PlayStation, they have a refrigerator, they have ovens and stoves. In other words, the data becomes contested for those who don't feel like that particular data point, right, is making the point that we wanted to make. And the same is true of our issues around housing or any number of things with respect to dealing with issues around low and moderate income families. you say there is a challenge, well, and you have data to prove it, well, other folks have data to suggest that there may be different. So data in and of itself will not get us out of the backfire that we see. And so one of the things I want to say, and I think it's important for us not to have this data conversation as a independent conversation outside of the conversation around narrative, because the data that you have can never be the story or the narrative. The data has to serve the broader narrative that you're trying to make. And so what's the case that you're making and the data that can best support that? And one of the more recent writings that a colleague and I did, I'm going to share that in just a second, around some of these issues, we say very specifically when we think about housing that without a messaging strategy that helps the public to imagine or to see housing differently than the way they currently understand it, that new data or research does little, essentially, to undermine the sort of backfire that we see. Rather, the data becomes the focus of that backfire. So data and evidence certainly can be used to enliven a message. It can be used to support the message that we're providing. It can be used to enhance the message, but it cannot be the data, that we have to be thoughtful about the kind of messages that we are creating as part of that. So some of you may have on the line, may have seen the report that a colleague of mine, Nat Kendall-Taylor at the Frameworks Institute, we did a joint paper around You Don't Have to Live Here. And we've been, and I would say Enterprise has been working directly with Frameworks on a number of different parts of this sort of messaging work around housing to really get up and underneath these issues around the backfire. And so in that report, you can get that report from Enterprise's website. If you just go to enterprisecommunity.org, or even just type in You Don't Have to Live Here at Enterprise, you'll get that report. And it details kind of what are the major areas of backfire that we see in the housing space. Certainly the one at the top is probably the most pernicious, I think, and probably the strongest of them, this sort of mobility, personal responsibility narrative, where people say buy the house or the apartment that you can afford, stop making poor decisions, and then asking me to pay for them. And people, that is a backfire that comes consistently, and it's consistent with the title of the report, which actually came from one of the comments to an affordable housing article that appeared in one of the cities that we looked at as part of the research that we did. And people consistently say that, right? So, listen, I'm sympathetic to the fact that people may be even housing insecure, but if you look on the left side of that, the separate face and zero-sum thinking backfire, they'll say, I'm sympathetic, but that has nothing to do with me. I'm struggling too. It's not my responsibility to solve somebody else's problems. And so you see that separate fate. I don't see my fate as directly connected to the people that you're talking about. And so because of that, you know, I'm sorry to hear that people are struggling, but it really doesn't have anything to do with me. I'm struggling too. I got problems. We all have problems, right? And so I won't go through those. Certainly you are welcome to download the report where it goes through, right, some of those things that are what we call operative narratives on this issue. But I want to just say that one of the key areas of backfire that we find is in terms of the facts. So if you look at the bottom right side, the facts don't fit the frame, that when you say, right, people are really struggling, or you say things about what's happening and it doesn't fit the way that people already think about this issue, it backfires. So you say that, so let me give you an example of that. So at the top, and it's a shame that the bills aren't in here, but more than 11 million renter households are severely cost burdened, paying 50% or more of their incomes for housing. And a lot of us in housing say that. I would say I have been certainly guilty of writing in this way. In fact, when I'm not careful, sometimes it will come out. And so I would say it's not that any of us are that we aren't all trying, but when you say that statement is a trap, because what it does is evoke the backfire of mobility and personal responsibility. People will say to you, well, yeah, that's exactly why they're poor. Poor people make poor decisions. They're paying too much for their housing. What they should be doing is figuring out what they can actually afford, what's actually within their budget, and then finding housing that they can afford. And it may be that they can't afford a high-cost housing market. They can't afford a D.C. or San Francisco, or maybe even in Atlanta. Maybe they need to go to Kansas, or maybe San Francisco, or maybe South Carolina, or maybe Alaska. Right? That's a better market given what's in their budget. But what they should not be doing is paying that much for housing and then asking the rest of us to subsidize, right, their bad choices. So there are lots of ways you can redirect that conversation. I would say always when you get into that kind of myopic conversation with folks, you got to frame higher. The higher version of that is to say, listen, you know, all of our paychecks, you know, are not getting bigger, but the rents are. And that fact is pushing many of our neighbors out of our community. In fact, many of our neighbors who are leaving have been longtime residents of this community who watched their children grow up here. They've gone to church here or synagogue or whatever it is. They have played with their children in our parks, and now after making those contributions, they're being edged out. We can do better. And the reason why that works better than that data snapshot that you see on the left is because it redirects attention away from the issues of individual agency. It's not that individual people are making good or bad choices or they're paying too much, right? It's that there are broader structural issues happening, that the rents are more expensive, the paychecks are not, right? Those are not things that I have any control over as an individual person. I don't make those kinds of decisions. Those are structural issues. There's a causal explanation in there, and it's larger than me as an individual making decisions. Another redirection, if you wanted to be data-driven about that and you wanted to use this data about, let's say you wanted to use that data about how much people are paying, the redirection on the left is where you want to go. You want to talk about, in our city, we're a can-do city. We're building a new reality for our people, a new future for our children, a new model of healthy communities, and providing a great place for all who live here. And that starts with providing quality homes and thriving communities. No matter the size of your wallet, you deserve, or we all deserve, a shot at success. And then if you want to provide that data snapshot, the data snapshot to provide is not just those folks at the lowest end of the spectrum here that are called housing cost burden, but across the spectrum. And what you can see, the blue here is what, the red is in 2005, and by 2014, almost people in every income demographic were paying more for their housing. So this is a universal issue. This is something that you can say a lot of us are struggling with this, and the benefits of being thoughtful about the housing market in our area allows us to provide benefits back to everybody. So why does that work? One, it's a more productive value at the top of that message. We love, 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 love American pragmatism. You can do it, we can do it, we love that. When people get that American pragmatism, it goes a hell of a lot farther than saying we should help those people, which is often what our existing messages devolves into, even when we use the best data that we have at our disposal. The second part of it is it's about collective efficacy. We can do it, not that individual person needs to figure out how to manage their money better, but we, right, have a collective and shared responsibility in thinking about and solving this problem. It also provides that future orientation, and it's optimistic. So as I say in many places where I write about these issues, it's that future orientation that is so important. Our brains are actually wired for optimism, and so many of our messages are so depressing that people disengage. And so the challenge and the opportunity for us is to think about how we give people a sense that this is a problem that we can solve, that American pragmatism, that is our collective problem to solve, that we can create a future that looks better for everybody. And the data that you want to share is that this is a shared problem that we're all trying to solve that may benefit all of us when we solve it. So from that vantage point, we know essentially why some of that's backfiring. The narrative is important. If you don't have the data and the narrative aligned, even the best data you got, even if enterprise provides, data at the street level, it won't change, our ability to either make the case or not. So the third issue I want to talk about, and I realize I'm going through this quickly, so I'm happy to leave some time for Q&A for folks who want to ask questions. But the third one I want to get to is just how we begin to avoid some of the backfire. So first of all, in the report that I shared, and you can get that off of our website, we provide 10 things that we as housers can do to survive the backfire, right? There are lots of things that we can do to get people up and over all of that backfire stuff, the mobility and personal responsibility craziness and all of the separate states and zero-sum thinking, and how do you get people up and over the notion of crisis and how, there are lots of things that we can do. And so many times when I talk to different groups, I go over different parts of this work today. I want to just highlight one thing here just to give you an example of what are the kinds of things you can do to overcome that backfire. And then I want to actually introduce some new things that actually are not in that report but are specific to the data piece. How to use data more effectively in messaging. So at a general level, the story of us, I think, is so important. Some of us think, I think there are two things that many of us have tried and tried often. So I'm a data person, so when I got in this business, I really did think, I was naive when I, graduate school 20 years ago, I really thought that the problem was data. I thought that if you just threw enough data at it, if you could just get better data, that you'd have enough evidence that people would change their minds. They would say, yes, why, yes, we should be investing upstream and addressing some of these issues and problems. Why, yes, we should be addressing affordable housing and the lack of food deserts and all these different things that when you address them upstream, they're cheaper to solve, you do it more effectively, right? You get better communities, all these things that we know come out of the interventions in the community space. So that's one part of it, the data piece. And then there are the folks who, so that did not work. For all the reasons that I just talked about, data in and of itself, right, cannot solve these problems. They need to be solved in a variety, right, in tandem with other things. But the other thing that often has happened to us in our field is that we understand the importance of telling stories, and storytelling has become a very important part of our work. The challenge for us is that we've gotten into the rut of only telling the stories of the folks who are directly affected or being challenged by issues of poverty or lack of affordable housing or those circumstances. And I certainly understand that, right? We want to provide a window into the world of folks who are struggling, and we want to give voice to people who often remain invisible, right? The challenges remain invisible. The hard part about that is those stories, when they're not done well, can push us into the state of othering even more than they already are. That is to say, they become stories about them, those people who are struggling, not stories about us. And the stories that have the ability to change public policy, to change the nature of how people engage with this issue, to change their willingness to lean forward in terms of system change, right, rather than to lean out, are really when people can see themselves inside of the story. And the challenge for us is, even with the best data that we have, right, combined with these incredible narratives of people struggling, is that we haven't begun to tell really robust stories about us. The stories about the teacher who is faced with a room full of homeless kids and can't teach, right, the subject matter, right, of his or her education, mostly because they're trying to just deal with the outcome of the children who are in deep trauma associated with moving and not having stability in their lives. Tell that story. Tell the story of, I'll give an example, tell the story of the Starbucks owner or manager who's trying to manage a workforce in the middle of a high-cost housing market. And even when Starbucks pays a decent wage, it's still, right, not enough usually to support folks having a decent apartment or a decent space. Talk to them about the turnover that they're facing or any number of employees in the region. Those kinds of stories are what help people to see their stake in our success. They see themselves inside of the story. And I love this quote from East of Eden. If the story is about the hearer, it's not about the hearer, he won't listen. And so the rule is that a great and interesting story is about everyone or it won't last. And so the challenge is to begin to tell the story of us. So I want to give an example of this. I saw a great, fantastic vignette I loved about a couple in Detroit, Greg and Letitia. This is a true story, who fell in love. They were both homeless but fell in love, and for the last, I would say, probably 10 years, have been on the streets of Detroit, where I'm from, trying to sort of eke out a living. And it was a beautiful story about their commitment to one another, even in the context of being homeless. The problem about that story is if you tell it in isolation, right, it is a trap, because what happens is lots of folks don't see their fate as connected to Greg and Letitia. They say, well, I'm really sorry about that. That is the saddest story I've ever heard. But they don't see how their actions and their support for addressing the situation that Greg and Letitia are in actually has residual benefits for them, right? Why they have a stake in that, in solving that for these two individual people. And so redirection is to frame higher, right? To talk about the prosperity of the region depends on the smart investments we make to ensure that people who work here have a place to call home here. and every dollar that we spend to help a homeless person find a home actually returns back to us 100 times over in cost savings. And best of all, these homes actually create jobs for everybody. And then you can tell the stories of a wide variety of people in the community who are affected by this issue of affordable housing and who have a stake in solving it. So you're going to tell the story of the teacher, of the Starbucks owner, and then also the beautiful story about Greg and Letitia. Now, the reason why this works is it's the story of us. It begins to tell us why the public has a stake in the story of Greg and Letitia, and for us to see our stake in it and our place in that story. It moves away from charity as a motivation for action and much more to this idea of investment. This is an investment in my future as much as it is an investment in Greg and Letitia. And it takes advantage of what we know is that connection between housing and jobs. People are constantly concerned about this issue of jobs, and when we connect it powerfully to housing, it becomes even more powerful. And so I would say that the data that you want to surface now, right, the data that you present in the context of this kind of story actually has the ability then to impact the conversation versus, right, in the way that it was being served up before. So the final thing I want to say about, I'll say a couple of things about the two things that are not in that report, but that also relate directly to what I would call surviving the data backfire. So there are a couple of things here. So there are two things I want to say. Both social math and anchoring are techniques that you can provide that really get people, that really address people's cognitive biases when we're thinking about these kind of issues. So sometimes when I work with groups, this is just an example, what I'll do is I'll take their messaging. This is a snapshot of a person, a group I was working with gave me a messaging, and I started to, to show them in the existing messages what essentially where all those pieces were falling. At the top of that message, if you start out by talking about crisis and affordable housing, you just lost, right, the majority of the folks that you're trying to get access to, the people who are not already bought into. One, because that crisis messaging we know does not work, right? It makes people disengage rather than engage. But also the language of talking about affordable housing as an issue is challenging. People associate affordable housing with public housing. They're associated with people of color. There are all kinds of things which are negative when they pull out the drawer of what that means. So I will sometimes walk people through kind of where in the messaging this is going wrong and where we need to sort of think about how we tweak the language strategically to address some of these issues. So the only thing I wanted to say about this as we get into this conversation about data, particularly if you go down to, I think it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the fifth paragraph there where we start, can you imagine? This is really interesting place where the writer is trying to they're trying to showcase this data. They got great data, they want to use it. So can you imagine is what they say. That means that if you're working hard full-time at minimum wage, earning $15,000 a year, your housing costs are $12,000. The actual data shows that the lowest 25% of wage earners in America have just $423 per month to spend on everything else, on food, on transportation, health care, and child care. And that's a paltry sum. That paltry sum has actually been going down. Compare that to the upper 25% who have nearly $9,000 a month to spend, and that number has been going up. Got it? Got it? Did you get that? So the challenge is for us is you got great data in this argument that you're trying to make for affordable housing. The problem is you just lost your audience because they don't know what the hell you're talking about. You've got so much going on there. And it's not just in this, and I want to say just here, it's not just the issue of that you've got so many data points going on, right? Even if you clarify this and made it, really clear, the challenge is that it's hard for folks to consume and digest numbers in the way that we got them. I mean, think about how many numbers you see in the newspaper, right? 1 in 5 people have this, and 23,000 people, and 4,800 people, and right? So we're constantly bombarded with all of these news articles with little snippets like this, and people can't consume the information in that way. So one of the ways to address this issue is what cognitive scientists call social math, and all it really is a fancy way of saying that you're going to take those numbers and give it some visual power, right, to have people either in the way that you write this up, you can use metaphor, or you can use some kind of visual picture, or you can actually use just pictures on the screen next to the words that gives it some visual power. And what we know is that people actually remember, right, more of those numbers, or at least the magnitude of those numbers, when they get it in a picture, more visual form than when they get it in that kind of narrative form. So I just give some just general examples here of some social math examples. On the right side, 7,000 high school students drop out every school day. That's a stack of desks 12 Empire buildings high. And so you can see the visual next to it. This is every day in New York City. That is astounding when you step back from that. Now, what the point of that is, I don't necessarily have to remember the number. What I remember is the visual image of that Empire State Building, right? And that 12 of those high. On the left side is a statement about people who've been physically abused or raped or stalked. 12.7 million. I may not remember that number, but that's approximately the population of New York City and Los Angeles combined. And so when you think about the visual of that, just the numbers of that, I may not remember the number, but I remember the magnitude of that, and that's something that I can turn around and talk to somebody about. Another good example, I think I'll skip that one. Another good example about just in Oregon, the number of kids in poverty, you could certainly just say there's 182, and you could give that number in a narrative form. But what they've tried to do is compare that to stadiums, relevant stadiums. They said that basically there are enough kids in Oregon in poverty to fill 7 stadiums, right? And so now your brain sort of does this thing of thinking about stadiums, right, and how many of those you could fill with just the number of kids who are in poverty. This one from Baltimore, the cost to incarcerate one person from Baltimore could buy 1 month of housing for 30 families. And what they're trying to do is to suggest that we have to look at our public policy as an investment in our future. And is this the future we want, the kind of incarceration, versus what we need for supplying what families need in terms of housing? Another great example, that this reminds me, I put this in because the one on the left reminds me that we're about to be in a budget season at the federal level, which is really going to be very interesting. But in Ohio, they had a tax cut on the table, and they were trying to get people to understand essentially how regressive that tax policy was. And they were saying, if you're poor in this tax cut, you get enough out of that pizza for 1 slice for a year. If you're in the middle, right, you can buy a cheap pizza maker. But if you're at the top of the income spectrum, you can get a round trip for 2 to Florence with enough left over for real Italian pizza. And they're trying to just bring to the table, again, with a very visual image, how regressive that tax cut is likely to be. So I won't go through many of these. I have a couple of these in the slide deck. I will probably make this available to folks. But some of the kind of visual images, the positive effect that stable housing has on pre-reading skills is comparable or larger than the effect of homework has on school achievement, or some of the things that we're seeing in the homelessness space for homeless kids in New York City, 1 in 7, and you can see the visual images next to there. This is one that I created, and I like this one because it provides this kind of assessment of how long, given what we're doing right now, how long would it take to solve these issues of housing and security. It will take 200 years to provide all the low and moderate income families with a home within their budget at the rate that we're now solving this problem. And so you can put a space-agey thing on it and say, like, great, if the year 2217 works for you, then great, let's do that. And so the idea is to show that we can do better. We can't sort of push these problems off to the year 2217. That makes no sense at all. So I won't go through this. So the last one I want to share before we kind of open up the spectrum here for talking about the data and opportunity 360 and also how that's backfiring some of these techniques is to talk about anchoring as an opportunity. So anchoring is sort of based on this sort of rule of thumb that's really based on this really common human tendency to rely heavily on the first piece of information that's offered when we're making decisions. So when you're having a conversation with somebody, if you say something initially, whatever that first piece of information that you bring to the table, that's the piece of information that probably has an outsized effect on their decision making. And so it's a cognitive bias, right? I can talk about why that is, but once you set that anchor in the conversation, all of the decisions that the person in front of you makes are centered around that particular issue. And it's a funny thing about our brains. I can talk about in a second about kind of why that is, but we should be thinking about how we use that, right, in our work. So for example, let me just give you a really practical example. If I were to say to you this paperclip, and you can't see me on the screen, but I'll tell you that I'm holding a paperclip, And if I were to say to you that this paperclip is incredibly valuable, oh, this is the most valuable paperclip in the entire world, and its value is somewhere between $1 and $50, and I ask you to guess. And then to another person, or even maybe to another person, I said the same thing. This paperclip that I am holding is incredibly valuable, and its value is between $1 and $5,000. So you guess, essentially, what's the value. In the first case, when I gave the 0 to 50 range, the average person would say probably around, I'd say $10, $25, somewhere in there. But the second person, because I've made the range so much wider, all the way to $5,000, is like to say maybe $1,000, $1,500. And so just by the anchor that I've set in terms of that range, I've actually shifted the way that people begin to reason about that issue. Now, that is a very kind of simplistic explanation of anchoring. For our work in terms of systems change, we can do a lot better about this, but I want to talk to you about some of the ways we have not sort of fully used this in the right way. Some of my colleagues at Frameworks often use this example, and I think it's a useful one, about myth and fact sheets. So when you have myth and fact sheets, people often give the myth first, and they say this was a flu vaccine myth that the CDC put out, this sort of one-pager, and they put out the myth first, and then they have the facts that came afterwards. And what was interesting about this, the CDC did some analysis of this, and what they found was that when they went back to ask people, essentially, right, what they thought about it to get their assessments of the information in it, people remembered the myth but did not remember the fact. Right, so they remembered that first piece of information, but they could not remember the fact, right? And what was worse is that they remembered the myth, and they attributed the myth back to the CDC. So when they wanted to say how they knew that the myth was correct, they said, well, the CDC told me, right? Which was not exactly what the CDC had in mind. And so that's a great example of you just anchored the thinking in that first piece of information, and now all of the thinking in the later conversation revolves around that. That's the thing that people remember. That's the thing that becomes central in the conversation. And so from our vantage point, the challenge or the opportunity for us is to understand how to use that. For those of you who want more information about the structure of why that happens from a cognitive standpoint, Daniel Kahneman does a great job in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, where he talks about essentially how our brains actually function and the reason why that first piece of information becomes the anchor with which you think about other kinds of issues. I won't do that online, but if people want to ask me about that in the Q&A period, I'm happy to talk about why that actually happens from a cognitive standpoint. What I would say about that, however, is how, like, I give some examples. I did a blog post just a little while ago for my colleagues at Rethink Health, talking about how we can begin to use that as part of our use of data, right? So if you know that first piece of information becomes the way that people start to think about that data and information, then why don't you use that strategically? So I talk about anchoring that first piece of data or that first piece of information that you get in your messaging around the solution and around the solutions that's at the systems level, right? So if you do that, what happens is that the conversation has the ability to live at the systems level rather than where it normally goes when we have these conversations about affordable housing, which is people devolve into conversations about individual people. Why didn't so-and-so save enough for retirement? Well, why didn't they make better choices? That's an individual level. Is he or she deserving of the resources that we want to put behind these issues? The conversation we want to have is about systems. How do we make sure that people have what they need? Do we have decent transit systems? Do we have decent access to health care? Does our health care system work and function on behalf of low and moderate income families in the way that it should? And so anchoring that data at the top is so important. And most of the time, we do this the other way around. We start by talking about the number of kids in communities who are obese, or start by talking about the numbers of people in the community who are paying too much for housing, or the numbers of people who, right, don't have jobs, and that anchors the conversation in a place where we don't want it to live. And so I give a number of additional recommendations about that, saying, don't anchor the conversation in the problem. Don't start with the problem, start with the solution, because you want to anchor the conversation in the solution, not the problem. Don't start by talking about systems change. Anchor it in the aspirations that people have, that forward-looking orientation toward the work. Don't anchor your message in the past, and don't use that past data. Anchor it in the future, because that's something that you can create together with folks in your community. Don't anchor your messaging in a value that you know doesn't have any resonance with the stakeholders that you're trying to convince around this, because again, it gets anchored there and it's hard to move essentially once you set that anchor. So I'll say, I know this was a long process. I did a lot in this 1 hour. I warned you at the top of this conversation. I warned you that I often start, that I often have a long list of things that I want, because I get so excited about this that I get on the roll and I can't stop. But I think there are 3 things that I wanted to convey in this. One is that there is an enormous amount of data that's available through Opportunity 360 that you should avail yourselves of. We're going to be doing more of these kind of webinars, really drilling down, not only giving you access to what you see online, which is the enormous report and some of the other data-driven tools in the platform, but really showing you how to use that data in very specific arguments and messaging, and to think about a whole range of strategic priorities that we all have around helping low and moderate income families. Then the second part of this was really talking about being very careful not to confuse the data with the message, right? That those things, that the data cannot be the message, that it can't, right? Otherwise, it will become the focus of the backfire, and that's not what we're trying to engender. If you are not being careful about how you're using the data inside of the conversation that you're engendering, then all you're doing is creating much more fodder, right, for folks who say, you know, those people essentially can't manage their own lives, and that's why we're all having to pay more in our tax money, because we have to address these issues. And then the third thing was, I hope to have given you a couple of just techniques. There are 10 recommendations that we make in the report, specifically around getting over the backfire. I gave you the story of us, which is one of the things that are in that report. But I also gave you 2 additional ones that are not in the report. One is really thinking strategically about social math, bringing the visual element to the data, because you know that is the way that helps people connect to it and understand it and feel the weight of it in a different way. And then also anchoring. If you know that first piece of data that comes at people is going to be the one that centers their thinking, that anchors the conversation, then you want to be very strategic about how you're using that data to anchor effectively. So I'm going to stop there. We still have a little bit, about a half an hour or so on the clock, and I'm going to ask Donna and Tina, who've been copiously looking at your comments and questions in the chat box and all that kind of. I'm going to ask them to open up the lines and to allow us to then now have a conversation about any of those things. And on the screen, you'll see there are 3 things that I've listed. One, if you go to our website, you can certainly get the report that we did around these issues that outlines the narrative and the backfire. The second thing is the opportunity report that allows you to download data about your neighborhood or community within 7 seconds or so. And then for those who want to directly connect with me, Twitter and other kinds of ways, there's an opportunity to do that. So.
Excellent. Great. Thank you, Tiffany. And to start off our Q&A, just a reminder that if you have questions, now's the time to type them into the Q&A box located on the lower right-hand side of your screen. Make sure it is directed to all panelists, which is the default, so we make sure that they are seen. And we will try to take as many as we can. And we've got a few that have already come in, and let's get started. The first question for Tiffany is, how current is the data that Opportunity 360 pulls from?
Great question. How current is the data? So we have scoured, I would say, the available resources for each one of those sectors, for education, for housing, for workforce development, for health. We've scoured to find the most current data that we could get that has national, that's coverage national, but that can be drilled all the way down to the neighborhood level. So, so the most current data, so it'll be different for the health folks. The data could be, 2015. For some of the housing folks, could be, 2000, probably 15 as well. But it just differs because the data sources are so different and the sectors are so different. I will say there are about 200 different sources of data in that report. And what's useful about that is if you look at the bottom of any of the tables in that measurement report, all of there are links to all of the source of that data. So if you want to actually find where that data is, you want to go back and look at it, you want to look at what the available years are, or you look at the data and you don't believe us, or you got your own ideas about that, you can go directly back to the source and get that data to understand what's most current, what, and all of the user guides related to that. Having also said that, I'm sure another question that people may have is, again, how often will we update that data? So we will update that data quarterly. So every quarter we do a general update of everything there, especially for some of the real-time, for some of the data metrics that have to do with the sort of housing markets and those kinds of things. So yeah, I'll also say, just as a matter of course, there are 3 sources of data. I would say the data comes from 3 different sources. One is proprietary sources, or one is public sources, all the publicly available data we get from HUD and from the ACS and from the census and from all the different federal agencies and that kind of stuff. The second source of data is proprietary data, data that we've either bought from private sources to make and made that available, or data that we have made use agreements with, like WalkScore, TransitScore. We have use agreements to bring that data over because we think it is so important. And then the third source of data is residents. Some of the listing tools, like the Streetwise tool and some of the Esri tools, that's data coming directly from residents about what's happening in their neighborhoods and communities and why they want to address those issues. Great.
All right. Our next question is, regarding your redirection messages, have they gone through focus groups or et cetera to show if they work better?
Yeah, so one of the things, so that's one of the reasons we've worked with the Frameworks Institute on this. Some of you know I used to be the research director and then the director of impact and evaluation at Frameworks, so I understood from the outset that their approach would be evidence-based. And so we've done, so the rigor, I would say, of the messaging that you see or the conversation that we're having around narrative development is quite extensive, both qualitative and quantitative data. Quantitative data with the highest levels of rigor, so treatment and control group, national representation over samples, particular populations, to make sure that when we say that a message works, we know it works, and we can provide both qualitative and quantitative data to show you in the same way that we would apply the rigor to any other scientific study. So great question. Thank you for that.
And next, we have a lovely compliment from Ben, and he would also like to know any tips on defining affordable housing in the first place when talking to non-insiders. This often causes confusion right off the bat.
Yeah, big time. So that was one of the big takeaways when we did a quantitative assessment with the Frameworks Institute, and it just came back with just all kind of craziness, I would have to say. And then we were trying to figure out what was wacky about some of the responses that we were getting quantitatively. And when you looked at what Frameworks calls the peer discourse sessions, it was really very clear that, and people said is, I don't know what the hell you're talking about when you say affordable housing. First of all, I don't have a very good idea. First of all, when you say that, it makes me think of public housing, which I really don't like, but I don't know what you mean by that, because what's affordable to me is what's in my budget. So if I look at what I get from my job and I look at how much money I make, and then I figure out what I can afford given what's in my check. So I don't know that there's a standard that anybody could apply to that. It just depends on, and it also depends on what you want. So some folks want to live closer to downtown because they want to get to work, or they don't like to be on a bus. And some folks want to have school-age children, and they need to be in neighborhoods further out, maybe where they can get better access to schools. And so they may be willing to pay more of their incomes, right, for housing because they want the proximity to those kind of amenities. And so what's affordable to them in terms of what they're trying to get after may be very different from somebody who is, a millennial or a senior. And so they push back consistently on this idea that there could be a standard that you could apply to people as a kind of across the board, because they didn't feel like that really represented those circumstances, and that people should be more responsible with their resources. So that's the challenge of that. So I would say that in terms of the way that you see in the presentation, in terms of the messaging itself, I never use the words affordable housing in the redirections or the messaging. I always say things like making sure that we are providing or making sure that people have access to homes or they have access to a decent place to live, to lay their head at night, right? Because those are the kind of things that will at least from a descriptive place sort of resonate. But anytime you say housing, people don't connect to that. People don't live in housing, they live in homes, right? And certainly when you put affordable in that, it gets tougher. So I would say as a placeholder, we've been talking about homes and talking about the quality homes that people need, having a home that fits within a budget, or those kind of words, but never those two kind of words together. And I will say that I think, when we put that initial report out, I was nervous about that recommendation, because I'm like, how do you tell affordable housing providers or affordable housing advocates not to say affordable housing? But I mean, I think once you see the data, and sometimes I know Frameworks has videos, and we sometimes show the videos of people reacting to that term, and when you see people react to it, you will know, you will quickly think, I will never say that again, because of what it does to the conversation.
Great, thanks. Our next question is, what strategies would you recommend for working in majority-minority communities to overcome the tendency to disassociate oneself from the plight of the other?
Say that one again, Donna.
Yeah, this is a great question.
Yeah.
What strategies would you recommend for working in majority-minority communities to overcome the tendency to disassociate oneself from the plight of the other?
Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly what they mean with majority, minority, and especially if disassociate from the plight of the other. I would say, in working in this field, I would say that communities of color, majority, minority communities are the communities that get disassociated from. So I'm having a little bit of a challenge sort of understanding where that's coming from. But I would say that what I think where you're trying to get at is this issue of othering. How do we get away from this idea that those folks are different? And when you announce that there's affordable housing development going into a community where there are differences, right? The pushback that you often get, at least when you're talking about the communities that are not communities of color, but right, who don't often have people of color in those communities, you get that kind of initial pushback about those people. I'm not racist, but and all the things, or I'm not, I want opportunity for everybody, but and then all the stuff that comes after that is just stuff you really don't want to have a conversation about. So I think a part of the conversation that we have to do is begin to have a conversation about the story of us, that it really is about the kind of community we want to live in. It's really raising up that notion, regardless of whether you're in a majority-minority or you're in a minority-majority, I can't tell which one, but lifting up this conversation about who is it that we want to be. We want to be a community where, regardless of whether you are the cashier at the local Safeway, or regardless of whether you are the president of the local foundation or the president of some major multinational corporation, that everybody has a place here, and we are working to ensure that people can live with dignity in this particular community. We're trying to ensure a future for our community and for our children that helps them to understand that everybody and anybody can be successful here, regardless of where you start out. I think that is what's supposed to be kind of our American dream, although we don't often get there. But I think espousing the values of that, right, in our messaging, and then providing data that supports kind of where we fall down in that and where we can work on that is always a better place to go than trying to other those people, right, in any way, shape, or form. So I'll just stop there.
Okay, our next question. If you're creating strategic communications for affordable housing in a very high-cost city where there is no complete, quote, solution to anchor messages within, would you start with vision, goals, and/or progress?
Where there are no, it's a high-cost market and there are no solutions. I don't know about that. I don't know that I would accept the way that that's described. I think there are solutions in every situation, and I think the data and Opportunity 360 tries to give you a little bit of a window to that, those pathways. So even in high-cost markets, where are the places that what is it that we can leverage about that community that's working well to solve some of the challenges that are not working well? So we're trying to create strategic visioning, messaging around that. It's really using that data to say, here's what, all right, folks, here's what we got that's working really well. Can we leverage that to address some of these issues that may not be? And housing may be one of the things that we're struggling with. I mean, I live in a fairly, I would say, affluent neighborhood in Columbia, Maryland. I wouldn't say affluent, but I would say it's better than a lot of the sort of, you know, affordability issues across the DMV, the area. And I think a part of it is, you know, from my vantage point, how do we preserve the affordable housing that's here? And I think, you know, Columbia's done a pretty good job historically as a planned community of saying we want all incomes here. We want all racial and ethnic groups here. We want this to be an inclusive community. And so that kind of messaging, I think, always is better than that. Whether you're in a high-cost market or not, that kind of messaging, I think, is important.
Great, thank you. Next question, will there be an opportunity to learn about involving our communities and have them offer input, especially offer input that's within the framework of opportunity, the way you so clearly explained?
Yes, absolutely. And actually, had I been more focused, I would have said even more about Opportunity 360 just as a data platform that it is, or just as a platform that it is overall. Because I say that, you know, when we think about outcomes, we outline specifically 5 really big outcomes in terms of, you know, housing, education, health, transportation or transit, and what's the last one I didn't say? Health, I think I got them all. But those 5 issues, and it's not that we don't think that there are other things that are happening in neighborhoods and communities. There's a lot. There's arts and culture. There are all kinds of things that make a neighborhood vibrant. But our framework was really saying, we stepped back and we said, what are the things that you got to have? Like, you cannot have any level of opportunity in this society if you don't have a place to lay your head at night, you don't have access to education for yourself to advance in your own career, your work, and educate your children. You don't have access to health, healthy places, or well-being. If you don't have access to a job or some kind of way to make money for your family, and you don't have access to get around the region at the most basic level, you got to have those. And so I think the framework is around those as kind of like, this is bare bones here, people. If we can't deliver this back in every community in the nation, then we've really got some problems. But having said that, that doesn't mean that there aren't other ways to sort of think about opportunity even beyond that as outcomes for folks. And I think we are very open to that in a number of different ways. So absolutely, I would say if you've got ideas about that, there's a place to contact us on that and talk. We'd love to talk to groups across the country about being involved in the outgrowth of the work. This is sort of our sort of beta version, our sort of version 1.0. But we envision 2 and 3.0 that will evolve as our community partners say, hey, listen, this is great, and we also want to be able to talk about this because this is an important part of us being able to make the case for this work that we're doing in this community. So absolutely. Thank you so much for that comment.
And our next question is, do you have any suggestions regarding terminology like households, which is too jargony and sterile, and families, which excludes individuals?
Yeah, that is a tough one. So that is a big tough one, and I would say for the most part, when we talk about the messaging, we generally speaking talk about families because that is the warmth of that as a concept, right? It endears people to that more so than anything else. But it does have its challenges from a framing perspective, right? I could talk about that, but I won't. So for the most part, I would say families is probably better than individuals or households, but there are challenges with that. All the things that you mentioned, when you do for individuals, like for example, a lot of the homelessness statistics are about the sort of broad, kind of the largest category of folks who are homeless are individuals. They're not necessarily families. They're a large category of folks who are individuals. And so when we talk about how do we address that, it becomes a challenge. So all that to say, I'm not sure that there is a nice, neat answer for that. I think families always engenders folks better, engenders a better conversation than some of the other ones, but it has its drawbacks as well, and I certainly recognize that.
Okay. So you've got a few questions here regarding the Opportunity 360 site. Should affordable housing developers and others use Opportunity 360 to place residents in high opportunity neighborhoods with higher scores, or do these entities have a responsibility to increase other amenities if in a high poverty neighborhood?
Oh, I love that question. Thank you for that question. So I would say, so first of all, a lot of the sort of federal policy in this area has been about mobility, and mostly because we wanted to study what happens when you take folks who have been in very high poverty areas and move them to places where they've been have low poverty. What's been the result? And the experiment has been to say, wow, look what happens for outcomes for people when they're in places where poverty is much lower. And that has been fine. The challenge with that is, you know, as we all know, first of all, you're not going to move, right? I mean, if you look, you saw that map of Atlanta. What are you going to do in the city of Atlanta where you've got that level of poverty across the city? You're going to move half the city to another city? I mean, right? You're going to relocate poverty. It doesn't just even from a practical standpoint, doesn't make sense. But more than that, I think the notion that people can be rooted in the social fabric of a place, that they could have lived and have histories within a place is important, and the respect for that, I think, is important as well. So the data, that in no way, shape, or form do we want to inspire people to try to conspire about how they can move poor people to places where opportunity exists. I think we want to have, as you know, a sort of the both-and strategy is how we often talk about that in enterprise. We certainly, when those places where opportunity exists, where you've got, you know, great schools and you've got access to grocery stores, you've got access to transit, and all that great stuff is happening, fantastic, but it's not great if low and moderate income families can't afford to live there. And so the challenge for them is, then how do you create opportunities for low and moderate income families? And that's great. But there's also the importance of investing in places that are troubled, that may not have those access, that may not have access, but also need to have better schools, and they need better access to transit, and they need, right, all the other things that. So from our vantage point, this is definitely a both-and approach. And even in the way that we have been rolling this out to our partners at the state and local levels, at federal, you know, it's been in exactly that spirit. Let's look at the places where you've got, right, decent transit, and you've got low poverty, and you also got, like, okay, so what's a strategy that we might bring to those kind of neighborhoods? But then also let's look at the neighborhoods kind of in the middle, where they've got middle-of-the-road schools, and they've got decent, you know, housing prices, and, right, there's a different kind of strategy what we might employ in those neighborhoods. Then let's look at other neighborhoods. They may not have great housing stability, but they've got really great anchor institutions that are specifically reaching out. So I think all that to say, I think we recognize that you have to have a very nuanced strategy with respect to how we think about housing, and our line is never that we want to have one gear that is move everybody to high opportunity neighborhoods. It's that we want to make sure that all neighborhoods are communities of opportunity, and we're thinking about what the strengths of those neighborhoods are, and we're trying to leverage that in the service of those issues that are still challenging in those places.
Great, thank you. We have several questions that I'll combine into one, and that is around the measurement tool in Opportunity 360, and whether it's possible to put different areas together in a batch in a single report.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. Thank you for that. So I'd say that for the most part, on the existing site that's on our website, you can't do that. The only way to do that is to put in that address, and you get the what comes out as that for that particular neighborhood as a census tract. I think for later iterations, we will probably add some functionality that allows you to put that together. And I would say for some of our community partners for which they have a vested interest in kind of thinking about how those census tracts apply together. If you sort of talk to us, essentially, essentially contact us. Essentially, we can perhaps help some of the folks put some of those census tracts together. But I would say the later iterations will have that. For this first iteration, we wanted to provide just for every neighborhood just that kind of basic layer of data, and then to make it at the lowest level of aggregation, and mostly because every partner that we have has a different kind of geographic space in which they're in. Some of them are continuous care communities where you can put multiple census tracts together. Some of them are, so we wanted to provide at least a basic layer of information for every census tract, and then for those of you who want to combine them, you have the data. You can do that manually on your own, or the next iteration will also probably have some of that functionality built in. We get that question a lot, so we're certainly thinking about that.
Okay. In a similar vein, can we enter or send data from our resident services outcomes to be used in the measurement report of Opportunity 360?
Great question. So I would say that my team can help you do that, to overlay kind of administrative data or the kinds of data as part of the platform. I will say that you'd have to reimburse our time to be able to do that, but certainly I think the ability to overlay not just your own administrative data, but if you've got some places you've got better local data than some of what they've been in Opportunity 360. So I would say, for example, in San Francisco, they have we have really good environmental data in Opportunity 360 at the tract level, at the community level, and then some of that is comparative, kind of broader. But I know in places like San Francisco, they have fantastic climate data that's even a wider range of indicators there. And we're happy for folks in San Francisco, if you're working in that environment and you want to see more of those data points on there, happy to work with folks to be able to overlay that data to get even a richer picture of what's happening locally. So absolutely, yes.
Okay, we have time for, I believe, one more question before we start wrapping up. And before we get to that, just a reminder that you will be sent a link to the recording of this webinar in case you missed any part of it or you simply want to revisit. And we also greatly appreciate if you could fill out the very brief survey form that will pop up after you leave today's event. And for our final question, which is a bit of a tough one, what would you recommend as the best way to overcome NIMBYs who are insistent that all affordable housing negatively affects the value of their homes?
Love that question. Perfect question. So I think, what's useful about that question is actually the thing you need to do for NIMBYs is the thing you need to do for everybody else. That sort of NIMBYs are just the ones that just get under our skin the most, because you want so badly for these folks who come out and they, in our opposition, you was like, where were you when we were trying to address all these social issues, and now that we have a solution and we're trying to, invest in affordable housing in this neighborhood, now you come out, now you got something to say. It's just like, anyway. But I would say the same thing about that I would say that in all of this messaging, the number one thing that you're trying to do is to convey the value proposition. The number one thing you got to do is help folks to understand why they have a stake in your success. So why do I have a stake in the people who may be coming to this neighborhood and I don't know them and they don't have, right? So from the vantage point of, well, what is it that I gain by supporting that? Because what happens is, for the NIMBYs, the loss aversion issues are significant. So when I shared that slide in the deck where I was talking about NIMBYism, I was talking about the biggest thing that happens is they recognize they're going to lose something. In fact, I was in a conversation just earlier last week, anyway, end of last week, and a colleague of mine was just talking about the challenge they've had where they've got NIMBYs who have decided, and this is in California, that they don't want to give up their parking garages, that they live in a fairly, dense area. They've got parking garages. The city has proposed that they turn those parking garages into housing because the housing shortages are so severe, and the community is fighting because they want to keep parking, right? And so the challenge is, I said to him, listen, you got a situation where they're going to lose something. I know directly I'm about to lose my parking space, but what you need to help me understand is, what do I gain? What do I gain by, right? So how do you convince folks who are concerned about parking that they actually benefit by having a person in that parking space who lives there and who is able to raise their family there versus that? That is the number one thing I would say for us who are thinking about the issues of low and moderate income families. How do we help them have a stake in our success? For some folks, as I gave in some of the redirections, it's about the prosperity of the region, that we all, that to the extent that we're investing in our communities and our people, we all get the benefit of the residual kind of shared prosperity that comes from that. For some folks, it could be especially in areas like I know the areas of the South where they're concerned that a lot of their young folks are leaving because they don't have economic opportunity in places in Tennessee and other places like that. So what happens when you have a more vibrant economy that can actually support your children who have gone off to college and now they want to come home and you want to see those grandchildren, right? The way that that happens is when you're able to attract broader, larger employers to a region, and they're not coming to a place where there's so much inequality, where there's not an opportunity essentially to house people effectively in a housing market that makes sense. So it's all that to say, I mean, I could talk ad infinitum about that. The kind of most recent conversations I've been in are around this issue, about those kind of issues, but some of the health and housing space where you're trying to get hospitals to come into housing as a market and vice versa, housers to invest in the health space, where we're both making the case to each other that we need each other and being very specific about what our value proposition is to the other person. So I'll stop there, but that really is, I would say more than anything, the challenge that we have to make as part of our work.
Great, thank you. There are some questions that we were not able to get to today, but I will make sure that they are sent to Dr. Manuel so she has access to them and can get back to you. And with that, we are at time. Any final words for us?
Well, I would just say that, you know, we live in precarious times here. We live in a place where we can become frustrated when we have, especially as a data wonk, I would say I've been, you know, as a PhD in public policy and I went to graduate school and got all this sophisticated, you know, experience using data, handling data, making a case with data and all this stuff. It can be very frustrating when you see the kind of conversations that are happening that dismiss the evidence and data and research that we all do. But I think what I hope you got out of this is, one, that help is on the way in terms of providing data that we can use that's actually actionable for thinking about strategy and advancing what's happening in communities, but also, two, that to the extent that we are able and willing to be strategic about how we use that data, embedding it in messages that are much more thoughtful and thoughtful about the kind of narratives that work, that we can actually have a different kind of conversation in our communities about what our communities need. So with that, I would say thank you so much for joining us. I know 90 minutes in the context of your week and your day is significant, so I appreciate you. As the airlines always say, I appreciate you spending your time in investing in us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tiffany, and thank you to all of our attendees today. We hope to see you online again very soon at another Enterprise Live Online event. Goodbye.